You know what finally pushed me over the edge? I had built this white oak garden bench. Took me the better part of 2 weekends. Mortise and tenon joints, chamfered edges, the whole works. I sealed it up with a premium marine-grade polyurethane, 3 coats, sanded between each one, did everything right. 18 months later, the finish was peeling off in sheets, and the wood underneath was gray and punky in spots. Water had gotten behind the film and just sat there, trapped, rotting the wood from the inside out. I was so frustrated I nearly gave up on outdoor projects altogether. Then I stumbled across a documentary about the Gokstad ship. This is a Viking vessel that was buried in clay in Norway around the year 900. When archaeologists dug it up in 1880, the oak planking was still sound, still tight, after nearly 1,000 years in the ground. And here I was, struggling to keep a bench intact for 2 summers. That contrast stopped me cold. These Norse shipwrights were waterproofing vessels well enough to cross the North Atlantic in open water with nothing but natural materials, no silicone, no epoxy, no polyurethane, and their work outlasted mine by roughly 998 years. Today, I am going to walk you through exactly how they did it. Not the mythology, not the Hollywood version. The actual methods, the actual materials, and the actual science behind why it all works. Plus, stick around to the end because I will show you how to make your own pine tar caulking cord that you can use on any outdoor woodworking project this weekend. Let us get into it. What we are really talking about here is a question that matters to anyone who builds anything meant to live outside. How do you keep water out of wood permanently without relying on modern chemical sealants that crack, peel, and fail? The Vikings answered that question so thoroughly that we are still finding intact ships a millennium later. And the beautiful part is, every single material and technique they used is still available to you and me right now. So let me start with who these shipwrights actually were and why their methods deserve this kind of attention. When most people think of Vikings, they picture raiders with horned helmets. But the shipwrights, the men who actually built the longships and gnars, were highly skilled tradesmen solving very specific engineering problems. Scandinavia is a land of deep forests, long coastlines, and brutal weather. Wood was the primary building material for everything: ships, houses, churches, bridges, and it all had to survive in conditions that would destroy most modern outdoor projects in a few seasons. The North Atlantic is about as punishing an environment as wood will ever face. Constant salt spray, freezing temperatures, relentless wave action, and a hull that flexes with every swell. A rigid waterproofing system would crack on the first voyage. A surface film would get scoured off. These builders needed something that could move with the wood, reseal itself, penetrate deep into the fibers, and last for years without maintenance in open ocean. And they figured it out. Not with one magic product, but with a system. Every element, from how they split their logs, to how they overlapped their planks, to what they packed in the seams, to what they brushed over the finished hull, was designed to work together. Take away any one piece, and the system gets weaker. Put them all together, and you get a vessel that could carry 30 men and 10 tons of cargo across 1,000 miles of open water without taking on more than a bucket or 2. What struck me most when I started studying this was the underlying philosophy. These builders were not trying to seal wood against water. They were working with wood's natural behavior, using its grain, its flexibility, its ability to swell and move, as part of the waterproofing itself. That is a fundamentally different way of thinking than what most of us were taught, and once I understood it, I started seeing my own outdoor projects completely differently. Let me start with the first and most fundamental piece of this system, and it is something that happens before a single plank is shaped. Viking shipwrights did not saw their planks, they split them. They would take a straight-grained oak log, sometimes white oak, sometimes the European sessile oak that grows all through Scandinavia, and they would rive it. That means driving a froe or wooden wedges along the grain to cleave the log into radial sections, then working those sections down into planks using a broad axe and sometimes a draw knife on a cleaving brake. Now here is why that matters so much for waterproofing. When you rive a plank, every single wood fiber runs continuously from one end of that board to the other. Nothing is cut across, nothing is severed. The cellular structure of the wood stays completely intact, and wood cells, when they are unbroken, are remarkably good at resisting water penetration. Think of each fiber as a tiny sealed tube. As long as you do not cut across it, water cannot get inside. Compare that to a sawn board. A sawmill blade cuts across thousands of wood fibers with every pass. Each one of those severed cells becomes a tiny open channel that can wick water into the heart of the board. That is why sawn lumber soaks up water so fast when you leave it out in the rain. The end grain is obviously the worst, but even the face of a sawn board has far more exposed cell openings than a riven plank. I tested this myself a couple of years ago. I rived a piece of white oak off a section of log I had in the yard, and I cut a piece of white oak off the same log on my bandsaw. Same tree, same moisture content. I left both pieces out in the rain for 48 hours, then weighed them. The sawn piece had gained noticeably more weight. It was visibly wetter and darker. The riven piece had shed most of the rain right off the surface. That was the moment I stopped thinking of riving as some quaint historical curiosity and started seeing it as a genuine technical advantage. For the Vikings, this was not optional. It was foundational. Every plank on the ship started with unbroken grain, and that grain became the first barrier against the sea. Now, with those riven planks in hand, the next piece of the system is how they assembled them, and this is where it gets really clever. Viking ships are built in what we call clinker construction, or lapstrake. Instead of setting planks edge to edge in a flush surface, the way you see on most modern boats, each plank overlaps the one below it. The lower edge of the upper plank sits on top of the upper edge of the lower plank, and they are fastened together through that overlap with iron rivets and small diamond-shaped washers called roves. Think of it like clapboard siding on a house or the shingles on a roof. Water hits the surface and runs downhill, and at every seam it is directed outward and down by the overlap, not inward. The geometry itself is shedding water before any sealant even enters the picture. The overlap, which the Norse builders called the land, is typically about 1 to 1.5 inches wide. The two surfaces of the land are carefully fitted so they mate tightly when the rivet is driven through and the rove is peened over on the inside. This creates a mechanical clamp along the entire length of the plank. And because the planks are riven with continuous grain, the mating surfaces are smooth and regular, which makes for a much tighter fit than you would get with sawn, rough-textured lumber. What really impressed me is how this design handles movement. A wooden hull in the ocean is constantly flexing. Waves push the planks, temperature changes swell and shrink them, and the entire structure is alive with motion. In a Carvel-built boat, where planks are set edge to edge, any movement opens a seam and lets water pour in. But in a clinker hull, the overlapping planks can slide slightly against each other without ever opening a gap. The overlap maintains the seal even while the hull is working. I had a chance to examine a replica Nar a few years back, and I remember running my hand along the inside of the hull, feeling how each land was tight and firm, but you could sense that there was just the slightest ability to move. It was not loose, it was flexible, and that flexibility is what keeps it watertight in conditions that would destroy a rigid joint. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now that you understand how the planks are split and how they overlap, let me get to the part that really fascinated me, because this is the primary seal, the material that actually makes the hull watertight. And it is not what most people expect. Viking shipwrights caulked their seams with tarred wool, sometimes animal hair, usually from cattle or horses, but most commonly raw wool, taken right off the sheep, still full of natural lanolin, twisted or rolled into thin cords, and thoroughly soaked in pine tar. Here is how it was done. Before two planks were riveted together, the builder would lay a thin rope of this tarred wool right into the land, the overlapping surface where the two planks meet. Then, when the rivet was driven through and the rove peened tight on the inside, the wool was compressed into the seam under pressure. It filled every tiny irregularity in the surface, every slight gap, every place where the two planks did not mate perfectly. Now here is the genius of it. Wool is a natural fiber that swells when it gets wet, so when the hull hits the water, that compressed wool expands and presses even tighter against both plank surfaces. The seal actually gets better in use, and because it is soaked in pine tar, it resists rot, it stays pliable, and it does not break down even after years of constant immersion. Compare that to modern silicone or polyurethane sealant. Those products cure to a fixed shape. They are rigid, or at best, slightly flexible when new. But as the wood around them swells and shrinks and moves with the seasons, those rigid sealants crack. They pull away from the wood. They open channels for water. I have seen it on my own projects more times than I can count. A beautiful bead of silicone that looked perfect in September, cracked and peeling by March. The tarred wool never has that problem because it is not fighting the wood's movement. It is moving with it. When the hull flexes, the wool compresses and rebounds. When the wood swells, the wool accommodates. When the wood shrinks slightly, the wool expands to fill the gap. It is a dynamic seal, not a static one, and that distinction is everything when you are working with a material that is always in motion. I tried this on a small project last year, a water trough I was building for the garden out of white oak. Instead of running silicone along the inside seams the way I normally would, I packed thin ropes of tarred wool into the joints before assembly, clamped everything tight. That trough has been sitting outside through 2 full seasons now, full of water, and it has not leaked a drop, not one. With the seams packed, the Norse Shipwrights moved to the final layer of their system, and this one is still in commercial production today, pine tar. Specifically, the kind historically known as Stockholm tar, because for centuries, the Swedish port of Stockholm was the major export hub for this product. Pine tar is made by slowly burning the resinous roots and heartwood of pine trees, usually Scots pine, in a kiln or tar pit with very limited air. The heat drives out the tar, which collects and flows into a vessel. It is thick, dark, aromatic, and one of the oldest wood preservatives known to humanity. What makes pine tar different from a modern film finish like varnish or polyurethane is how it interacts with the wood. Pine tar does not sit on the surface. It soaks in. The wood fibers absorb it, and it becomes part of the cellular structure of the wood itself. This means there is no film to crack, peel, or blister. The protection is inside the wood, not on top of it. Pine tar is naturally antifungal and antimicrobial. It resists rot. It repels water, not by creating a waterproof barrier, but by making the wood fibers themselves hydrophobic, meaning they resist absorbing moisture. And it stays somewhat pliable, which means the treated wood can still flex and move without the preservative cracking. The Viking shipwrights would heat pine tar until it was thin enough to brush, and then apply it liberally over the entire hull, inside and out. Multiple coats, letting each one soak in before applying the next. They would pay special attention to the lands, the end grain at the bow and stern, and any area where water contact was heaviest. You can still buy genuine Stockholm tar today. Several Scandinavian companies produce it using traditional methods. I've been using it on outdoor projects for the past 3 years, and the difference compared to modern film finishes is night and day. My pine tar treated pieces darken to a beautiful warm brown. They smell incredible, and they are holding up better after 3 years than my varnished pieces held up after 1. Application is simple. Warm the tar gently. You can set the can in a pot of hot water until it flows easily. Brush it on with a natural bristle brush. Let it soak in for a few hours. Apply a second coat. On porous wood like pine or spruce, you might want 3 coats. On dense wood like oak, 2 is usually plenty. Work in warm weather if you can, because the heat helps the wood absorb the tar more deeply. Now here is the thing that finally tied all of this together for me, and it is the real lesson behind everything I have just described. No single one of these methods is a magic bullet. Riven planks alone will still absorb water eventually. Clinker overlap alone still has seams. Tarred wool alone would rot without the tar. Pine tar alone would wear away without reapplication. But when you combine all 4, riven grain that resists water penetration, overlapping construction that sheds water mechanically, tarred wool that seals dynamically and swells tighter with moisture, and pine tar that penetrates and preserves the wood from within, you get a redundant, layered system where each element covers the weaknesses of the others. This is the part that changed how I think about outdoor projects. Most of us modern woodworkers approach waterproofing as a single product decision. We go to the store, we pick a can of sealant or varnish, we brush it on, and we expect it to do everything. Repel water, prevent rot, stay flexible, look good, last for years. No single product can do all of that. And when it fails, we blame the product and try a different can. The Vikings understood that waterproofing is not a product. It is a system. And once you start thinking in systems, even for simple projects like a garden bench or a planter box or a fence gate, your outdoor work starts lasting dramatically longer. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. No judgment here. I did all of these for longer than I care to admit. The first pattern is reaching for a film-forming finish as the default for outdoor projects. Most of us do this because it looks good initially, and it is what the hardware store recommends. But a film finish traps any moisture that gets behind it, and moisture always gets behind it eventually. The Viking approach of using a penetrating treatment like pine tar means there is no film to fail and no space for water to get trapped. The second pattern is using rigid sealants on joints that move. I did this for years with silicone and construction adhesive. It works indoors where wood movement is minimal, but outdoors where the humidity swings are huge, rigid sealants crack and separate within a season or two. The tarred wool approach gives you a seal that moves with the wood and actually gets tighter when wet. The third pattern is ignoring grain orientation entirely when selecting lumber for outdoor use. Most of us just pick boards for appearance and straightness, but the Vikings understood that how the grain runs through the board determines how that board interacts with water. Continuous uncut grain fibers resist water. Severed fibers absorb it. Even if you are not going to reeve your own planks, choosing quarter-sawn lumber with straight, uninterrupted grain will dramatically improve your outdoor project's resistance to moisture. The fourth pattern is treating waterproofing as a one-time event. Brush on the finish, put the project outside, never think about it again until it fails. The Viking system is lower maintenance than film finishes, but it is not zero maintenance. A fresh coat of pine tar every couple of years keeps the protection active. The difference is that reapplying pine tar takes 20 minutes and a brush, while repairing a failed film finish means stripping, sanding, and recoating the entire piece. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning, this is something you can do in your shop this weekend, and it will give you a traditional caulking material that works beautifully on any outdoor woodworking joint. You need two things: raw wool roving, which you can buy from any fiber art supplier for a few dollars a bag, and genuine pine tar, which you can find from Scandinavian suppliers online or at some specialty marine supply shops. Make sure it is real pine tar, not pine tar scented product or a synthetic substitute. Take a handful of the raw wool and pull it into loose, thin ropes about the thickness of a pencil, maybe a 1/4 inch in diameter. Do not twist it too tightly. You want it loose enough to compress into a seam. Now warm your pine tar gently until it flows like thick honey, and work the wool ropes through it until they are thoroughly saturated. I like to use disposable gloves for this because pine tar is wonderfully sticky and will stay on your hands for days. Let the saturated ropes sit on wax paper for an hour or so until they are cool enough to handle easily. Now you have tarred wool caulking cord, the exact same material Viking shipwrights used 1,000 years ago. When you are assembling an outdoor joint, lay a thin length of this cord into the seam before you clamp or fasten it. The compression locks it in place, and the wool swells when it gets wet, tightening the seal. I started using this on every outdoor project about 2 years ago. Planter boxes, fence joints, even the end grain caps on a pergola. Not a single joint has opened or leaked. It is the simplest, cheapest, most effective outdoor joinery sealant I have ever used, and it has been around for over 1,000 years. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us wrap this up. You know, there is something humbling about realizing that a shipwright working with hand tools 1,000 years ago, had a better answer to a problem you have been struggling with your whole woodworking life. But that is exactly what happened to me when I started studying these methods. Riven grain, overlapping planks, tarred wool, pine tar. Simple materials, deep understanding, and a system that outlasts anything in a modern hardware store. Try even one of these on your next outdoor project. I think you will be as surprised as I was.